The state of the Islamic world today is a very mixed picture. There are 57 countries of the OIC. I've been an observer of the OIC for a long time. I've never seen the OIC more divided. Probably the biggest threat that the world is now facing is climate change. It's been projected since the mid-1990s, nobody listened, and now it's happening. If they realize that our collective survival requires collective action, then I think possibly we have a chance. We're not going to solve this problem by saying, I'm going to blockade you. If this is how we're going to behave, the world is finished. We really have about less than a decade to seriously decarbonize our economies. Within the Islamic countries, there's totally a vacuum for a science, climate and environment leader. If Turkey is able to play a leadership role, this is the role that a country like Turkey can play.
Ketebe'nin katkılarıyla hazırlanan Düşünce Atlası başlıyor.
Tell me, Ehsan, who is Ehsan Masood?
Who is Ehsan Masood?
Yes.
I am Ehsan Masood. I'm a science writer, science journalist. I have a very strong interest in the countries of the Islamic world, Africa and the Middle East. I also write about economics and I write about public policy. I have to be honest with you, I don't think we are going to see better days for a while. The path, the trajectory the world is on, it's not a great pathway, and people in research around the world, they're using this a new word now called polycrisis or polycrisis. I mean, in a sense it means what it says on the tin. We have the ongoing crisis of climate change, which is now accelerating, and it's moving to a situation where a lot of the projections that the scientists made in the 1990s, which is when I first came into science journalism, you know, at that stage, they were warning that we are going to see extreme weather. Where it's hot, we will see droughts, and where it is wet, we will see floods. The political classes didn't pay much attention. They just thought this is like scientists doing their own thing, and who knows if this is right or wrong. And the scientists were being quite conservative about temperature increase. I mean, we're at a point now where average temperatures are more than 1 degree higher than they were a while back. And we're heading towards a world where we could see somewhere between 2.4 or 3 degrees above the pre-industrial levels. And that is just, it's going to create a world that I just can't imagine. And we're starting to see some of the impacts of that now. The floods, the droughts, you know, in many countries. Then we had a pandemic, and the pandemic has completely inverted the world. I think one of the biggest impacts of the pandemic is on the cost of living, because, as we know, the world was shut down for more than a year and a half, and that's just completely messed around with manufacturing, with supply chains, with production. Because of all the tightness of supply, it's created a lot more demand, and the prices have gone up. Now, where we are sitting in the UK, inflation is, you know, somewhere between 8 and 10%. It's 16% for groceries, you know, but it's higher and lower in other ways. You know, when you go into the global south, the countries of the low and middle income world, it's just, I mean, off the scale, you know, 70%, 80%. You know, how are people going to survive that? And then the third sort of big crisis really is, in a sense, it's the aftermath, because we haven't really recovered from it, is the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. We're still feeling the embers from that. And these things are never linear. I mean, it's a sort of, there's a kind of reinforcing aspect. There is a reinforcing loop for it. And then on top of that, of course, then you look at the sort of the way in which geopolitics is being realigned. I mean, I can't remember a time when an American president was not, or was, in inverted commas, unwelcome in Riyadh, right? But that's the situation that we are in now, where the United States administration of President Joe Biden is not on the same page as the administration of Saudi Arabia and the countries of the UAE. And that's, you know, I think we're only just beginning to understand the implications. I don't know what the implications are of that, but that's an observation. You know, as journalists, we observe, and it's a clear observation that this is, I don't remember a time that's like that. And of course, China is becoming a very important counterweight to the United States. So, you know, I'm not in the business of predictions. These are just things, these are facts on the ground, they're happening. And when you bring them all together, you know, that is creating some winners and probably a lot of people who will suffer. So I can't talk about politics because I'm not really a commentator on political affairs, but I can talk about policy. Of course, policy and politics are intertwined.
Yes.
They are affected. I don't think there's any sort of one, often we try and look for patterns, don't we, to see, are we moving towards a more authoritarian situation, a less authoritarian situation, a more democratic situation, a less democratic situation. I don't think, in a sense, we're quite, it's too soon to see where we are. But these things that I've explained, the crisis, because climate change is going to create it is creating an economic crisis. It's no longer an environmental crisis, it's an economic crisis, because when a third of your country, which is what happened in Pakistan just a few weeks ago, when it's underwater, I was just a few weeks back coming back from a trip, and when your plane takes off and lands, you see entire villages submerged. So they've lost about a third of their land. Their rebuilding costs are anything between the figures are just sort of telephone numbers, 10 billion, 12 billion, 16 billion. So we talk about environment, but in fact this is going to be an economic and a cost of living and another kind of crisis. And similarly with the pandemic. The pandemic was, yes, of course, it's a public health crisis, and millions of people have died from COVID-19, and it's had huge implications for how policy making is changing in regards to public health. But that too is an economic crisis now, because the shutting down of the world economy for a year, 18 months, has had catastrophic impacts on livelihoods, on jobs, on people's ability to go and do their work, on education. So all of these things, yes, I agree in the sense that these are compartmentalized. It's public health, or it's environment, or it's whatever. But ultimately, this is going to impact people. In fact, not only is it already is impacting people. I think, so Islam has always had, it's one of the world's great religions. It's had a huge impact on the world in so many aspects. You would know this as much, if not better, than I would. I think the state of the Islamic world today it's a very mixed picture, because there are 53 or 57 countries of the OIC. And if you look inside the OIC as a unit, if we're talking about the Islamic world, then let's look at who represents the Islamic world. It's not the Arab League, it's not the Organization of Africa, or what is now the African Union. They include countries with majority Muslim populations. Let's look at the one organization which, in a sense, self-identifies as being Islamic in terms of its polity, and that is the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Conference. You'll have to correct me, it's 53 or 57, I think it's 57 countries in it. And I've been an observer of the OIC, particularly its knowledge institutions, its departments of science, education, public policy for a long time. I've never seen the OIC more divided. In 25 years, I have honestly never seen. Yes, there's always been the traditional splits, where you've got the power brokers, the traditional original power brokers in the OIC have been Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. Iran has had some influence, but it's often been an outlier. Pakistan has always been a big champion, a big supporter of the OIC, and it houses the OIC's Science Secretariat, which is called ComStec. But generally, they've been able to find common things to work around. Things that they then, because they have their differences, but they've been able to say, well, we'll do a big project in public health, because it doesn't matter what your particular ideology is, or particular political stances. Everybody needs public health, so we'll do public health. Or let's do education. Let's do a big fund for our universities. This has often been something the OIC countries have been able to unite around. I don't see that happening now. It's not it's the will. Sometimes the OIC has always, Iran and Saudi Arabia have always had problematic relations, at least since 1979, the revolution. It might have been a little different before then, when the Shah was around, but certainly since the arrival of the Islamic Revolution of 79, it's been an extremely tense, and of course now it's a particularly difficult and problematic time, in that sphere. Now, the GCC countries have always been united, and they are always still a very strong bloc. And of course, around them, there's a sort of group that includes Egypt, which has often been very close to that part of the world. Turkey has often played a very important, and I would say mediating or brokering role in the OIC when there have been problems. Turkey and Pakistan are probably the two countries that have tried to hold that line. But as the toxicity, and it is genuine, I mean, it's not a strong, it's a strong word, but it's probably justifiably strong. As the toxicity between Iran and Saudi Arabia has just increased, I think it's become more difficult for Turkey and Pakistan to actually step in and mediate. When you've got such problematic relationships, then it's even difficult for your scientists to say, you know, let's do a joint science project. Before you could have done that, and people would have said, yes, we have problematic relations, but we still agree we need to have better public health, we need to have better education, we need to have better science. I don't see that now. In the way that I used to within the OIC network system. I think it's different on a bilateral level. You know, there's still countries, but you know, I mean, even bilaterally, look at what happened with the blockade of Qatar a few years ago. You know, where one country within the GCC, which is supposed to be probably the most united unit in that group, you know, one country was frozen out by the others. And yes, things are back on an even keel, and of course the World Cup has helped, and there have been other diplomatic examples of rapprochement, but it's been difficult. I mean, Qatar was an interesting case because, you know, it's a tiny place. It's got a population of about 300,000 of its own citizens, and then it's got 10 times that, which are people from outside, an expatriate population. If you just look at they always prioritized education and science from the days of the previous emir, and you know, going on now, they've got branch campuses of many famous universities. They've got very productive research centers in the physical sciences, in biomedicine. They've got a very large public health campaign. Their workforce is international. Big, you know, when you've got such a small population of your own, so they've got Egyptian scientists, they've got Saudi Arabian scientists, they've got Bahraini scientists, they've got Omani scientists, you know, all working there. The minute that blockade started, these people were told to pack up and go. And, you know, that's not how, you know, that just isn't kind of great for confidence building. And so even if relationships are back on, it's not possible for then all those people to suddenly just return and kind of continue to doing what they are. So I think we are in a particularly problematic time, I would say. I think if there is to be common ground, there will need to be acceptance, and this is it's complicated, but I mean, if you bear with me for a minute or two, I'll try and explain what I mean here. So probably the biggest threat that the world is now facing is climate change. It's not obvious, particularly in the Western countries, because they have very strong infrastructure and they've got resilience. They've got, you know, very secure energy supplies. They've got good flood defenses. They now realize that they have to create defenses for extreme heat. I mean, we had, where we're sitting in London, we had 40-degree heat. Never seen that before, but we've had that. So they have the resilience to cope. You know, the vast majority of the world's people do not have that resilience. And so when climate change starts to hit, and it will begin to hit within a decade, then we're going to see some pretty awful scenes on our television and in other ways. And this is just a fact. You know, there's no argument about this at all. It's been projected since the mid-1990s. Nobody listened, and now it's happening. And it's happening faster than the scientists that I speak to projected in the 1990s. It's happening faster. Yes, there are lots of things that are happening which could turn things around, but you know, right now we're not on a good path. So if all of the countries which are in these networks, the OIC network, the United Nations, the Arab League, the African Union, if they realize that our collective survival requires collective action, you know, we're not going to solve this problem by saying, I'm going to blockade you, and I'm not going to talk to you, and I'm going to send my troops to you, and I'm going to pull my people out of you. If this is how we're going to behave, then we are truly screwed. The world is finished. It will soon, you know, it will shortly be on a really, really bad pathway. And so if they realize that our collective survival requires collective action, then I think then we're possibly we have a chance to save and to do good things. But if we don't accept that, and right now we're not accepting that, particularly the oil-producing states, because their business model is under threat from actions to solve climate change, then I think we're in trouble. So I think we're already seeing it. I mean, let's just look at the United Kingdom. which is seeing a lot more migration of people. This is an island, so people generally unable to fly, so they come by boat. And we're seeing potentially record numbers of people coming in from the global south into the United Kingdom, and I think that will only increase. The people who study this, they have a phrase, they call it climate refugee, environmental refugee. That's not the only reason people are moving. They're also moving for economic reasons. But I said before, climate change and the pandemic are creating economic crises. And so yes, there might not be a direct link, but it is, these things are having an impact. If I go back to the flooding that just happened in Asia, if a third of your country is underwater, well, you're not going to stay, are you, right? Suddenly you lost your home, you lost your farmland, you lost your livelihood, you lost all your family, your children have moved away, or whatever it may be. You're going to migrate. I think, so two answers to the question. So this is a very important year for, every year is, so the research, the scientific community has advised all of the policymakers in the world, including in all of the Islamic countries and just everywhere else, that we really have about less than a decade to seriously decarbonize our economies. And seriously doesn't mean let's have a bit more recycling in our kitchens and, let's just make sure that a few of us have electric vehicles, but properly removing carbon as the principal energy source across our economic sectors, in agriculture, in transport, in home heating, in industrial production. Now that is the kind of transformation which is like, this is no exaggeration to say, it's like the transformation of the Industrial Revolution, when we moved from a much more sort of pre-modern way of living to now the kind of lifestyles. And we have about a decade to do that. And every country has to do that. There was a time when people argued rightly that if you're a low-income country, you can take more time because you've needed more time, and if you're a high-income country, you should do it quicker. That really hasn't happened. Now, essentially, the whole world has to now move together. So I think if Turkey is able to play a leadership role, this is the role that a country like Turkey can play. Because there are some countries who are resisting, and there are some countries who are resisting more, some are resisting less, and some are moving further and faster ahead. Within the OIC system and within the Islamic countries, of course, you've got the countries who are part of OPEC, and they would like to go the slowest. And so I think in that sense, there is a vacuum. There's totally a vacuum for a leader, a science, climate and environment leader from within this block of countries. And I mean, frankly, everybody should consider themselves eligible to step in, because we don't have the time. I mean, I don't know how many times I've said this, that we have about a decade, maybe a little bit less, where the world has to seriously start decarbonizing. So if Turkey wants to step in and be that leader, a lot of people will be very, very pleased, because it isn't only Turkey's responsibility, it has to be everyone's responsibility. But there is a vacuum, there is a gap.
America, as you know, they didn't sign the agreement.
Well,
I mean,
America is a very interesting case. Well, I think, so if we look at the other, America is also, of course, one of the world's largest oil-producing states. It's not often described that way, but it's, it's in the same league as Saudi Arabia is. It's a huge oil exporter. And so if we look at the OPEC countries, of course, they take a different view, and their strategy right now around their foreign policy in relation to energy is that they will very, very quickly accelerate their decarbonization internally. So they're going to change their energy systems to more renewable and sustainable systems. But at the same time, they're going to continue to export. And they're doing this for two reasons. One is that, of course, they want to be able to comply with international agreements like the Paris Climate Agreement and the other agreements that they've signed up to. And for that, they must take domestic measures to get to net zero, or decarbonize by a particular deadline, 2040, 2050, 2060. But there is a benefit for them in doing that, because it saves them the oil. They're not using it for domestic consumption, they can store it and then they can sell it. And right now, that's what they're going to be doing. So they're going to be doing a lot more export. And I've seen some of the projections, they're not slowing down, they have no intention of slowing down. The projections right up until 2030 for the oil producing states is pretty much not just business as usual, but probably business as usual plus. And that is a worry, that really is a worry for the world, because it means that they're not serious about decarbonizing. Well, I mean, I would say that young Muslims have, I would think, careers in science have never been a big priority. Engineering might be a little different, and of course the other, in inverted commas, professions have probably been, more on their radar. But I think careers in science for people from minority backgrounds, Muslim community backgrounds, people who are from families who are Black, African, Black Caribbean, people from, possibly other parts of the world, which are historically marginalized communities. Careers in science have not appealed, and I think it's partly because when you choose a career, you choose something which is sort of in your family. You might have somebody in your family world, or it might be a recommendation from somebody in school that, you should go and consider this. And careers in science have never really been, they've not been on the same level as like careers in medicine or in engineering or finance and accountancy. And then secondly, of course, the science world itself has not been particularly welcoming, certainly in my generation. It's not been welcoming to people from minorities. Now it understands this because we have the data. We have the data that compared to the population of minorities in the general population, their percentage in academic positions, permanent academic positions, professors and so on is low. And so there are efforts underway to correct it. It's going to take a long time. And but the world that I now inhabit or occupy in science and technology has not been particularly welcoming. And I think it's on a path of change, but it'll be a slow change. So I'm one of the editors of a journal called Critical Muslim, and it's published in English out of here in the UK. It comes out 4 times a year, and I would say that we get very good submissions in fiction, in poetry. We don't do visual art in there. It's a primarily text-based publication, although it's online and in print. But I would say that because there aren't that many vehicles for Muslims, whether they're young or old, to be able to express themselves without fear of repercussions or censorship. That is something that we get quite a lot of submissions for. So we don't necessarily struggle in that sense. So
what they're afraid of?
Well, I mean, I think we know that across the Islamic world, in the countries of the OIC, there isn't necessarily always a media that is not controlled by, whether it's the institutions of the state or whether it's others, and it's difficult for writers and artists to be able to find ways for themselves to express themselves. And so what we found is that we've been going now for more than 10 years, and so because we're based in the UK, so we are operating under United Kingdom, the United Kingdom's sort of legal structure and apparatus, and that allows us to publish writers and artists and poets from all over the world, but particularly from Islamic countries, from low and middle income countries who don't have those protections in their own countries. And when we publish them here, it does give them a bit of extra protection, and it allows them to be more expressive than perhaps in ways they might not otherwise be in their own countries.
Thank you, Ehsan.
Teşekkür
ederiz.
Thank you very much.
Ketebe'nin katkılarıyla hazırlanan Düşünce Atlası sona erdi.